First, what integrity do postmodern therapies need to keep as they continue their lineage from generation to generation? We've heard today there's maps and some of these underlying sort of foundational or oriented.
I would say innovation. The idea, Michael and David, in one of their books, I can't remember if it was Narrative Means Therapeutic, what it was, but they said they never imagined staying in one particular place for too long. And I really like that idea. I hope if you were to look at my practice today, if you watched me practice today and you watch me practice in 5 years, you'd notice some marked differences. So I think the idea of innovating. I think also making sure that narrative therapy, I think Chris, forgive me if you didn't mean it this way, but I think I took the spirit of your comments to be this, that sometimes if we're not careful, narrative therapy can unwittingly become a colonizer, right? If we start getting into these conversations of this is what narrative therapy is and this is what it is not, I worry about that. I think narrative therapy can be a lot of different things. Now, of course, we might agree that if someone's doing straight CBT, that's not narrative therapy. I'm talking about within narrative circles when we get into those kinds of conversations. I've had some things I wrote 4 years ago, I had some people say, well, that's not narrative therapy. And my response is, well, maybe it's not. Maybe I don't know. Maybe then it's becoming something different. So I think the spirit of innovation and also that we don't unwittingly become colonizers ourselves and be, you brought up the narrative police, be sort of enacting the very rules that we're criticizing other therapies for enacting themselves.
Steve?
I think the integrity around theory is that theory always asks the question, what am I actually serving? And the reason our particular presentation was on the senses, the sense of touch and the sense of movement, because that's actually been left out of psychology altogether. In large part, the Stalls tried to touch on a little bit, or maybe punch at it, I don't know. But you have thinking therapies, you have feeling therapies. Nobody actually knows what sensing therapies are. Narrative therapy is the first therapy. Well, some of the family therapies will take the body that seriously. But all theories are fundamentally about deep wholeness and integration, and the ability to feel like your experience is a deep form of integration as it's expressed through language. And since we don't have any collective narratives that model that for us, because religious traditions don't do that any longer, then we're all in this horrible position of trying to do it individually, which never works. And then we have this fantasy that theories are going to somehow help us stay together. And then we line up all the people that we know that taught us that theory, and they're our family, they're our theoretical family. But in fact, we're trying to have a better body that actually, in a conversation, is alive and knows how to use language in terms of this is what's touching me, this is what I'm feeling, this is how I'm moving, and this is how my heart's acting in regard to that. The feeling life that we're sharing is revealing itself more clearly. So I think what always is the integrity of any theory is whether or not experience comes alive and it begins to be shared amongst people in such a way that they can feel the mutual meaning, as Chris said. We're trying to make meaning together. We're doing a pretty good job here, I think, actually. There's some pretty strong threads of good collective meaning making.
Yeah, I think what I heard between those two is innovation and sort of the intention of continuing to move, continuing to explore, right? And then I hear, and there may be also something more ancient that we forgot about that we need to bring together. So I think my next question is more about maybe we can say progression. If we can all assume that there is going to be some directions in which we try to take or hold our interest in therapies. So see if I can get this question right. What do you find helpful in the present day progressions of narrative therapy and postmodern psychologies?
I really like the idea of innovation as well. But what's interesting to me is in regards to progression is like, who are going to be the people that guide us, our practices further, you know? Being around John Winslade, I'm obviously very influenced by, because he's, you know, very much into theory and wrote about Deleuze. If you haven't read his article on Lines of Flight, you should. It's really a great article. It has influenced my practice in a great way, but he's taken these, I learned a new word the other week. It's called vulgaris. And I want to be a vulgaris, and that's my aspiration, or a vulgaris. It's this idea of where you make the complex really common, right? And I thought John Winslade had this really great skill of taking like Deleuze and really putting it down right into practice. Like, what questions might this come from this kind of thinking or idea? And so I think about progression. I think about who we're going to be, and that's why I talk about Liz Keating today, and I talk about Bruno Latour. And I talk about some of these people that we might be able to look to as ways of informing our practice as we move forward. And that's what gets me excited about like you know, who are the thinkers, and Gloria Anzaldúa, of course, and the idea of the Montalara is like really powerful to me about being in these in-between places. And so who are these thinkers that are going to help us? Who are the thinkers that are going to craft questions for us? And that's what I think that's what I think about progress.
What was that term again that you used?
Vulgaris, V-U-L-G-A-R-I-S.
It doesn't mean you just cuss.
So if somebody calls you
Yeah,
that,
it's cuss all the time.
it's like you're but I really, I heard it, and I've been chewing on it for now, like, and just the idea of like making the complex common.
I think for me what sticks out is continuing to take risks. I think of the things that we do being high risk, high reward, and that often us stepping outside of the box, whether that's putting our hands into a soil box or whatever we might be doing that's outside of the traditional, I think that's where a lot of that lies, this idea that if we can take some chances, if we can do some things that maybe raise some eyebrows, maybe the more the eyebrow raises, the better, not in like a ethical way, right? But you know what I'm saying, in a creative way. And so I think the more that we can continue to use the foundation as a means to innovate, to push some things into some new directions, I think that's where the magic of therapy won't get lost, right? This idea that we can continue to work in ways that are not predictable, that are not static, that aren't same thing, different day, different, you know, that we can innovate. And so I think inviting more of that sense of invigoration into taking risks and doing some things that might be outside of our own comfort zones, and trusting that perhaps that meaning can come in ways that we weren't anticipating it to if we're willing to do so. So I think that's one way to keep that sort of in a direction, is to push ourselves to do things differently, to try them out and see how that lands. So, yeah.
If there's a threat to narrative therapy's existence, I think it's what Chris just articulated. Like, theory in the absence of translation to practice, I think threatens to kill narrative therapy. Because what I hear over and over again is like with students is, this language, this Foucaultian language, you know, this shit makes no sense to me, right? Can you help? And so we need the John Winslades of the world, right? Who can take that and say, this is what this looks like in practice. Because I think sometimes, like a lot of the narrative therapy conferences I would go to, there'd be a bunch of white dudes on the stage, and they'd wax philosophical about Foucault. And as like the mixed racially brown kid in the crowd, I was like, what the fuck are they talking about? Like, I was taking in some of it, but I was like, and then moreover, like even now, a lot of the articles I write are to explain to myself how to take some of these narrative ideas and put them in practice. You know, like I've been playing around with anti-colonial ideas, which my colleagues Marcela Polenko and Makungu Akinyela write amazing philosophical articles about that. And I've loved that idea of decolonizing and anti-colonial for a decade. And then like 2 years ago, I was like, how the hell does this even show up in my work? I don't know. Like, I need to start figuring out how the heck this turns up in my questions. So I just want to reiterate what you said, Chris. I think that's so important. And that's where we need to, as many John Winslades as we can get.
So are your guides, who are the guides and risks? What risks are we willing to take? And I guess and then this, and then sort of the threat of theory, and not being able to translate to practice. I'm wondering if there's some parallel process to what our clients experience. They come in, right? Are we propped up to be guides? Are we asking them to take risks? Are we trying to use this kind of thin, dead psychological language to help inspire them when it's really impractical? So my next question is...
Can I just real quick
Yeah.
there, because that's a pretty, just want to simplify something. I think that narratives fundamentally, because they're deeply religious things historically,
Yeah.
what do they serve? And I think we always come back to that question. What is it that language serves? It fundamentally serves our relationship to the earth. So narrative's trajectory is actually a pretty big trajectory in terms of how is it that we live here in such a way that the context we live in survives. And at this point in time, that may not be all these human beings going to therapy as much as us learning something about how to speak about the earth, which I love your images, like sticking your hand in the soil. I mean, the earth is the thing that suffers the most. It's the most vulnerable thing. It's the thing that actually is the image of all our suffering. And as soon as we sort of quit using language about just in such a humanistic way, start to realize that language is actually about what's already been given to us already. I think that's a little simpler direction and easily atheoretical. You start reading literature, you start reading Proust, you start reading, people outside of psychology, because that's what literature has been doing forever.
Yeah, and I guess that also brings me back to this question about how is it introduced to clients, right? Are we bringing them back to something that's more ancient, central, something that they can connect to, or with your clients, do you find the practice of narrative therapy, you sort of introduce it as a posture, as an idea, overtly, or do you find it very natural entries into having these types of conversations because they do just tend to connect that easily?
I would say I do both
Yeah.
things.
Okay.
It really depends. Some people really cling to their problems so tightly that I introduce the idea of separating from it. But I think that whole idea of, I love the way Chris talked about it in terms of, because I believe much the same way that externalizing isn't a technique, it's not a tool, it's not a thing that you just whip out. It's just sort of a way of being and a way of believing. And when you show up in the room really believing that folks aren't broken, because that they come at their last wits, they've tried all the things, and then they come to therapy and they hate that they have to be there because it's such a stigmatized, dominant narrative in itself, which is pretty sad. But to start to take up the language, when I start taking up language that they're not the actual problem, but this thing is sort of acting its way on them, all of a sudden I'll have people just start to take it up as well. So it just sort of becomes, that implicit way of talking, and then they'll, then you catch them, like we've all heard say like, oh, I've never thought about it this way before. I've never even thought of anything as wacky as that. I asked a client the other day, like, why do you think you were sort of meant to suffer with alcohol in this way? Why is alcohol your friend that you're suffering through it with? What's up with that? And he's just like, that is something I've never thought of before. And when you start to do that, then they start to do it too. But then I've also had people that are like, no, I'm it. I'm broken. You're weird. And I'm broken. And I'm going to get you to believe that I'm broken. And then I say, wow, I hear that is just like Velcro. And I'm going to, you can keep talking that way. And I'm going to keep talking this way. And let's see what happens. And so it gets really fun really quick. So I would say both. I do both. Depends on the person.
I was saying this to someone this on break because I've been struggling with Travis and we've all had conversations about what do we call what we do.
Yeah.
And I've started inviting conversations into the ways that people perceive what's happening. right? So like, what would you call what we do in here?
Yeah.
Like,
How
what
do
would you name
describe
it?
it to somebody that isn't?
And it's been really cool because they would say these things like collaborative exploration or creative collaboration, and just all these things. And it'd be interesting if we identified ourselves in the ways that the people we work with identify our work. If that makes sense, right? So for me to walk around and say, "Oh, I'm this," but then the people that I work with experience me in a different way. Maybe I should privilege the ways that they. I was thinking about watching, the families in Chris's videos of listening to the people of how they speak to the work. Like, I feel like that is a more useful way. And so it's almost like I'm more interested in what they think we're doing than what I think we're doing.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But we have to have something to talk about when we
Yeah.
come here. So.
Another simple thing that you can just pick up on, something Travis either knew to do or fell into is, whatever whatever your client's listening to musically, I just ask them, what's your favorite song I need to listen to it this week? Just let that run through your body, because it's been running through that person's body all week, probably for maybe 6 months. It's their favorite, they're obsessed with it. Just listen to it, you don't feel like, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
It's their rhythm, and it's their sensing of what their world feels like. Then the words come easier afterwards, because you know what it feels like already on the unspoken world.
Yeah, there's still soul in music. I'd like to turn conversation to you all and offer a time if you have any burning questions for our panelists.
Well, I guess there's something we touched on at the beginning. I can't remember who said they started off as an existentialist. Or someone there, was it you? Yeah, that's kind of that was the first theory I was really passionate about when I got into this field, because I love that it looks outside of the field to bring in this grand multiplicity of voices or whatever. And I guess that led me to the question of, and then you had mentioned phenomenology as a method for existentialism. So I was thinking about how, as someone who's really into narrative therapy and existentialism, do you feel like that's pretty compatible, where you can kind of merge those in a productive way? Or do you feel like there's too much conflict there? I feel like we tend to be very you have to specialize in one specific niche, and I'm the kind of person that likes taking my favorite things from every theory and trying to synthesize something that works, that holds together. And I guess that'd be my dream, is to be able to just exercise both of those theories in harmonious interplay or whatever. So I was just curious about your experiences with that.
I have a very simplistic view of existentialism, so it was really easy for me to not get hung up on. I think all the things that I thought I would be doing as an existential therapist hasn't changed. It's just narrative has given me a way to ask better questions, or see a larger picture, or look for things that are constraining meaning making, right? But then some, y'all might come in and say something very different.
So you feel kind of at your core, you're still an existentialist, even if you don't necessarily, you may call yourself a therapist or a narrative therapist or practice narrative therapy, but there's still that part of you that's...
I'm still hesitant to call myself a narrative therapist, right? Because I think there's people who would call me not a narrative. I've been told I'm not a narrative therapist because I meditate. I practice meditation. I swear, yeah. Because meditation is an essentialist practice, and so I can't really truly be a narrative therapist. So,
that's the kind of
I've had that said
artificial
about
separation I want to avoid.
So that would go back to something Travis was saying about his comments. So I don't invest a lot in those kinds of I'm moving more towards I'm interested in deliberate practice. I'm interested and way of being. I'm very interested in how philosophy can inform the innovation and the progression of my work. And I really like what Travis said about 4 years ago when people looked at his work and said it's not narrative therapy. He was like, well, maybe it's something else. I really love that. Because I think that's, yeah. I hope somebody says that to me. So I wouldn't get hung up in that. You know, and that's that post-oppositional influence for me, right? You were there for that.
Yeah.
So, you know, trying to like avoid that, those walls, those containers, what Ken Gurner would call, walls of containment is what you would call them.
Yeah, that's exactly where my heart's at too, which I think is why I asked the question, because I'm about like breaking down all these illusory separations and divisions that we just constantly perpetuate in our field and everything. So thanks.
Jen, I had a question. You were mentioning with some people that you see they kind of dig in their heels in terms of telling themselves that they're the problem. Do you see most of the time that people come around, or do some people just maintain that and maybe terminate, or what's been your experience with those patients?
Well, I have a lovely background working in substance use, so ambivalence is like my thing. I love it because that ends up I end up usually externalizing that in a lot of ways of like, oh, you don't want to move from this or whatever. And I can hang out through a lot of resistance. We're not supposed to call resistance anymore. We're supposed to call it ambivalence. But, you know, there is a lot of resistance because why do you want to give up something that's working so well for you? That makes so much sense to me. So we have to sit in that a lot of the time. So I don't have people that terminate very often. They tend to keep coming back. And I think part of that is the weird nature of therapy, and part of that is because that's the only space they can talk about why they love doing what they do. You know, why I love getting high, why I love cocaine, why I love how this works for me in these ways. And then eventually we get to other stuff. And that's true with the people that are really, you know, mostly I get folks that are hooked on their anxiety so much they just don't want to let that go because it's just so, you know, it's a whole thing to them, and so we tend to sit in that quite a bit. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks.
So this question might depend on the client that you're thinking of, but what's your favorite question to ask clients?
One that I've never asked before.
Yeah.
Yeah. One that, like, I can't give you that question now. I have a new favorite one all the time. Like, my favorite one is when it just comes out of you, right? Like, you're just right in tune with someone and the question comes out. Those are my favorite, and it's one that I haven't asked. And by the way, sometimes the questions I'm most pleased with aren't the ones that are most helpful.
Never.
Just to be clear. People will come back and I'll be really pleased with the question.
What happened?
This was a great narrative question, and then they come back and they're fixated on something totally different than I asked them. Oh, this was really helpful. Anyway, so all I'm saying is I may not be the best judge about what the best questions are. Perhaps the people that consult me are better judges about the usefulness of the question.
For me, it's also when clients tell us, oh, that's a good question. Those are my favorite questions because I get to engage them in trying to figure out why it is a good question. And I often ask my clients to steal just a minute of their day at the end to ask them, hey, you made a remark about one question that I asked you. Can I please hear from you a little bit about what it is that you found helpful or meaningful or rich in that question? And so they give me the answer, I take notes of that, and then I may use that question with someone else. When I see that other person that has helped me with that question, I may let them know that I used their question with someone else, and I may thank them for helping me with that. So those might be my favorite questions. That's how construct that.
I'm going to give you a question.
Yeah, me too.
Because I want to say that agree with everybody, but also I think it's important when you ask the question. I'm going to Is it okay if I give you a question?
Sure.
Yeah, so, and I want to give you this question because it was grounded in theory and in that paper that John Winsley wrote on the work of Deleuze and lines of flight, right? And this question came out of that paper. So this is, I guess I'm trying to make a case for like how that can lead, all the heady stuff can lead to a question that can move people places, right? And so, and it's a very simple question. It's not very poetic, but it was, it features this in the face of whatever your client might be facing. And it oftentimes is an intractable problem when you feel very stuck and there's nowhere to go. But in the face of this thing, who might you be? What might you do? And the purpose of that question is to just give a little bit of space of, even in the face of intractable problems, there is personal agency. Okay, and then it might move people to, obviously it's an eliciting what we call becoming story, right? And so it's a simple question. I would say it can do a lot of things, right? And so that's a question that I think I find myself going back to time and time again.
Could you repeat it real quick?
Yeah, in the face of whatever the problem might be, right? And oftentimes I used to work in my training, I worked a lot with people experiencing homelessness, right? And so, and a lot of these things weren't going away anytime soon, whatever the problem might be. But in the face of this problem, it could be like, what might you do? Or even better, like, who might you be?
I'll give you a question too. I rarely ask it this way. Those of you that were here this morning already, or this afternoon, whenever you were here, those of you that were, I brought this up this morning. What are your preferred mediums of healing?
Great question.
I rarely ask that question just that way. Usually it comes in the context of the conversation that I'm having with someone. But Dave brought up the person that's consulting me that now both of us, both she and I, put our hands in soil when we have our conversations. Which is, I said this morning, that's pretty fucking amazing, by the way. Like just the smell and the feeling. I find myself asking questions I don't know I'd be capable of asking without that. And that all came by me asking that question for the last 18 months. And I think that this is a question I like also for its anti-colonial effects. You know, the idea that somehow I know the right medium for you to heal in. Like I'm going to ask you questions and you're going to reply and we're going to do this sort of Eurocentric thing back and forth and that shall be healing for you. That might not always be healing for people. So I've, again, a simple question, but it's taken me all kinds of directions that I'm not smart enough, don't have enough wisdom to know to go.
I always ask questions about what is this serving? Like, or what is this for? Because people don't get asked that, because that points you away into a future as opposed to internally. And I always try to bring it into the realms of children. So a lot of clients that I work with have children, and so I always ask about that. Like, if you had to sort of explain this to your kids, or what would they say back? So somehow bringing it into, you know, I don't think you would talk to your kiddo this way. How would you talk to your kiddo about it? Or if your kiddo was suffering from this, what might you say? So trying to bring in kiddos can be really helpful too, I think, if you are working with folks who are around kids a lot.
So, here's a simple question you can just play with. This can go all sorts of places, but you know, given the context that more than likely this person's coming to speak to you and you're a stranger, just ask the question, who knows you? Yeah, let me in on who knows you. How is it to know you? Because you're coming to a total stranger now. This must be, you know, this is already a pretty big wound right there.
Yeah, I like that. So I ask people what, I learned this from David as well, like, what am I gonna come to respect or appreciate about you, or something along those lines. And oftentimes people are taken aback when I ask that right off the bat.
Yeah.
And then they might say, I don't know, and then I say, okay, let me try to ask this a different way. Who would you say is someone important in your life who considers you really important in their life? And then so oftentimes I work with kids, so oftentimes they'll say my best friend. So like, Well, a best friend is like a big deal, right? So why are you the best friend and not someone else? What is it about you that this person sees that makes them want to be your best friend? Makes them want you to be the best friend? And typically that question really just brings such rich conversations about who they are and how others might see them.
It's lots of fun. Like, I like to go, who is it that knows you better than anyone else in the entire world? Well, say my mom, my partner, my whatever. And then I like to ask them questions as though they are that person. So if their name was Mauricio, I'd be like, you know, can I'll say, you know that person really well too? And they'll almost always say, yeah. I'm like, okay. Could you try and, like, and I'll take literally 30 seconds, and I'm like, would it be all right if you took a minute to channel them and try and feel what it's like to be that person for a second? Just be quiet. And then I'll this is not really Mauricio in this case, I'll say, Mauricio, and I'll ask the person questions about themselves as though they're someone else. And you saw Dave do a little, some of that in the transcript. It was a little different. He was talking to a future version of the same person, but you'll get all kinds, because if you just ask people what's great about them, but, you know, there's this sort of humility the culture has taught us of, well, I don't know. And then they'll usually say something like, well, I guess I'm kind, or something like that. That's not very rich, but if you can get them into these interviews that at first will feel weird, what's interesting, you're talking about somatic and body and so forth. When they get into these interviews, they'll hold their body differently. They'll literally hold their body. Like, I interview people as their grandfathers and so forth, and you will see 2, 3, 4 questions in, their bodies change, and it's, I love those questions, and I find them to be so much more rich than saying something like, well, if your grandfather were here, what would he tell me? That's fine, but when you ask them to actually channel that person, I feel like we go to a different place. So I love those kinds of questions. And the next question people usually ask is, isn't that weird? Don't people feel like that's weird? And both mine and Dave probably say something about that. Not really. Like, at first they think it's weird, but to be honest with you, as long as you don't act like it's weird, if you're just kind of acting like it's normal, they often will get into it without much trouble.
Therapy's weird. The whole therapy setup is really strange, and so I was acknowledge that. So a lot of what we're going to be doing here is going to be really awkward, but we're already sitting here, so.
If you look at my transcripts, the number of times I say, this might sound weird, or, you know, I say that a bunch. So, yeah, I guess it is weird. So.
It seems as though, I mean, presuming that people wouldn't mind going a few minutes over, maybe we could end with one last question. And for that last question, too, who you panelists, what's a question that you might ask yourselves, ask amongst yourself? Anything that you're kind of curious about or interested in, knowing that there's such a variety of experience here.
Outside of, like, how do we do this more often?
Yeah, maybe that's a conversation we need to have.
Well, in my practice, I'm trying to take back the influential part of my position as a therapist. I feel like there was so much emphasis in training as an area therapist and being centered. I've gotten to really interesting territories with clients when I'm influential, when I'm allowing my imagination to come through my questions, or to be part of the conversation as, you know, another being in the room. So I'm curious about how others are experiencing influential decenterness, I guess, what that balance looks like for some of them.
I suspect,
Yes.
I suspect that you and I are in a similar wavelength there, Mauricio, but yeah, I've been experimenting with that too. The idea that, you know, like, somehow that when I ask a question, like, to ask a question is to be centered. So I am centered in a way, and I have to take responsibility for my questions, and I have to take responsibility for my presence in the room. And that, so playing with this idea of it really is a co-creation. Like, long ago I used to be to this place where I was like, I do nothing. You know, I just, they have all the knowledge, and then, you know, through conversations with people over the years, it was like, well, no, I do contribute to this conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm giving advice or telling people what to do, but I have to acknowledge that the words I use to ask a question, even if I'm using some of their words within the question, is still influencing the direction. And so, yeah, it's like, I don't know the answer to this, but it's like, how much do I prefer to be centered, right?
Yeah.
And when and how, like, yeah, I'm really glad that you're asking that question. Because I feel like the idea that we're not ignores the influence we have in the questions. Yeah.
It felt like a power struggle too for me when I felt like I wasn't being discentered and I was being too influential, and I just kind of kept questioning myself about that.
Yeah.
And now I'm starting to feel more like this is okay for me to have these ideas and for me to bring them into this conversation and checking in with the person to make sure that if they're not meaningful for their process, that we can take those back.
Right.
I think for me, that's how I handle it and have come to terms with it, is just the check-ins that I do with my clients and being able to say, like, did this feel okay, you know, or like, did we push, you know, because you can get a pretty good feel of that. And I mean, I talked to Travis a lot about this, but going back and forth and figuring out, there's some clients that I'm much more like centered, and then there's other clients that I'm much more centered, and I think it's just, you know, it changes as the person and as the work asks you to change with it. So I think for me, it's not to like get away from acknowledging my presence, but it's more of being able to check in and say, does my presence feel like an okay one to be having?
And I'll just hammer the body again, because that's my jam. But I think the like there, you know, I'm really into body-mind psychotherapy and like really using my body as a tool and knowing, yeah, how am I staying embodied as a therapist? And often our bodies will tell us when we're too far in with a client and when we're too far back. Like when I'm pretty bored or pretty like, I'm going to sleep, you know, like how is it that I stir up my own embodiment, my own energy within my own body to stay within the conversation? Or if I'm just completely taxed after, then I know, oh, whoops, I was way too into it. So I play with that a lot, my own embodiment.
So checking in with clients, checking in
With you, yeah.
We're checking in.
Yeah, great question, though. Yeah, I like it.
I think my most difficult, the question that haunts me the most is about psychotherapy and culture, because I do teach and do therapy, and teaching allows me to sort of experiment with what does it mean for a group to be together, and what shows up with the group, and how easily, of course, it falls into these centered or decentered issues, but that fundamentally, if narrative believes in storytelling, then the real healing is learning to be a good storyteller, and which is actually a different thing than having a bunch of therapists help people re-story their problem. It's a different thing. They're not meant to be. I don't mean this with any antagonism. It's just a different thing. To practice being with people, telling stories, and then being aware that a lot of people are really bad storytellers, so you don't want to listen to them. And and AA has been a good long history of this. Actually, it's a great experiment in getting people together and say, "Can you be storytellers and create a community?" They've had some success with that. But what is all that serving? To some extent, it's a good question. I think it has something to do with even situations like this. What is this form of practice that we're into right now? Should it actually be more? Should it be not like this? Here we are, centered and audienced. And should therapy learn to be more like theater? Should it learn to be more like improv? Or somebody should just come out of the audience and say, yeah, and stand up and not ask questions and say, okay, this is what, it's something that's, brings more culture into the room and more life into the room. And I think that's theater, actually. And so, I struggle, that biggest question for me is therapy just really shitty theater? Is it some attempt to like just do theater on a one-to-one basis rather than like having the courage to do it as a group? I don't know. That's just my question. And psychodrama, sort of had it right all along.
Question I would ask everyone, not you don't have to answer this, but just to answer your question. I would want to know what was the biggest risk that people have taken in their conversations, and what failed most spectacularly. Those are the two things I want. And I'd want to know that not as a voyeur about the failing part, but also what failed most, like the times I've failed most spectacularly, that almost always goes somewhere important later. Sometimes it's 18 months later, sometimes it's 2 years later, but When I fail, not just when I fail, I know the discourses around that, just for ease of conversation. When I fail, that's one thing, but when I fail spectacularly, I know I'm onto something. As very honest as that might sound. Does it? I don't know if that makes sense to anyone, but I'd love to know how people are failing spectacularly, because I feel like that means you're on the cusp of innovation.
Yeah. Well, I hope. No, I was just going to say we're going to have to wrap up our time. Maybe we can take your last comment, Mauricio. And I'm getting the sense, Travis, that obviously would love to continue this conversation. I hope that, and we'll move into a time in our farewell where we talk about how we continue moving these conversations outside. But Mauricio, if you would close it.
Very quickly, so I had a client who recently came to me and she was like, will you just diagnose me, just tell me what to do? And I'm like, no, I don't want to. And she's like sobbing, you know? And she's like, I know I'm borderline is what she said. So I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about that and what that means and trying to engage with that. And she she was sobbing so much that I was like, okay, let's look at that freaking borderline criteria. And so we started looking at it. And so she's like, so I need to calm down, and she's like, okay, he's taking me up on this. She goes away, I see her a couple of times, and then one time she shows up and she goes, can we just go back to the stories thing that you were doing? Yeah, so that was cool, but it felt like, like I was failing at it, so it's just or a narrative even, but
I think that question, that answer actually gives you a really great idea of who you may even be consulting with soon, because as I mentioned earlier, we had that raffle. And so to wind our time down first, I want to thank the panelists. And I want to thank you. This has been a huge labor of love. Yeah. From between Megan and I, and for everyone to have come and invested so much of their Saturday and being together means a lot to me.